Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're going to be talking all about Lilith. We're going to be focusing on some articles from the Spiritual Seek, really fascinating stuff. And yeah, I'm so glad you could join us today.
Yes, I'm really excited to unpack this figure with you. Lilith's one of those figures who you hear the name and it's instantly evocative.
Oh, absolutely. And there's so much to unpack, right? You got ancient mythology, you got modern interpretations, feminist thought. It's a lot to kind of wrap your head around.
It really is. And one of the things that I find so fascinating about her is that she predates Jewish tradition. If you look back to Sumerian, Assyrian, Babylonian cultures, you find all of these figures, often female demons. You'll see names like Lilu or Lulitu,
Okay.
or even Lamashtu. And a lot of these figures share, a common thread with Lilith. They're often seen as these figures that threaten vulnerable humans, particularly mothers and newborns.
It's almost as if, back then, infant and maternal mortality rates were so high, and people needed a way to explain that kind of tragedy, right?
I think that's a really insightful point, because if you think about it, they needed some way to make sense of these really difficult events. And, these figures, these sort of demonic figures, could offer a framework for understanding something that was otherwise unexplainable.
Yeah.
And we see this even way back then, there's this chilling inscription on a Syrian tablet dating back to the 7th century BCE. It says, "O flyer in a dark chamber, go away at once, O lily." It already associates these Lilith-like figures with this sense of darkness, of danger.
Wow, 7th century BCE. That's way back.
Yeah, it is. And then, of course, we see Lilith mentioned in the Hebrew Bible itself, specifically in Isaiah 34.13.
Right, yeah.
And there she's depicted as, dwelling in desolate wastelands, really cementing that idea of her as an outsider.
Yeah. I mean, already from those few appearances, we already get this sense of her being separate from the norm.
Right, exactly. And actually that single mention in Isaiah has caused some debate among scholars, because some argue that the word Lilith might actually just refer to a screech owl.
Oh, so not necessarily the demonic figure that we kind of have in our minds?
It's possible, yeah.
Yeah.
It's possible, but, even the screech owl itself might carry some sort of symbolic weight, right? If you look at a lot of the ancient Near Eastern cultures, demon goddesses were often depicted with bird-like features, particularly wings.
Mm-hmm.
And so this connection to birds, even if Lilith just means screech owl, it still could potentially tie back into that ancient archetype of this dangerous female entity.
Oh, interesting, yeah. So even with that, more like, I guess you could say, a benign interpretation, there's still this sort of underlying sense of unease, maybe, or danger.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
So now I think one of the things that people find most interesting about Lilith is the idea of her as Adam's first wife.
Yeah.
And this doesn't come directly from the Torah.
No, this comes from later interpretations, particularly of Genesis.
Right.
And, it's interesting because in Genesis, we have these two different creation accounts, right?
Right, yeah. Like one where man and woman are created at the same time.
Yeah.
And then the other where Adam is created first and then Eve is created from Adam's rib.
Exactly. And that discrepancy, that difference, that's what kind of sparked the speculation among rabbis that maybe there was another woman before Eve.
Oh.
And that's where the whole idea of Lilith as like this first Eve really starts to take root.
Okay, so where does this idea first appear explicitly? Like, where do we first see this story of Lilith as Adam's first wife?
The first text that really lays it out is the Alphabet of Ben Sira. It's a satirical text.
Okay.
And it's from about the 9th century CE.
Wow, okay, so it's a while after the original text?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so what does Ben Sira say about Lilith and her relationship with Adam?
Well, in Ben Sira's version, Lilith is created from Earth just like Adam.
Yeah.
So right from the start, they're presented as equals. But Lilith, she's not really into this whole subservient role. She challenges Adam right away.
Yeah. I mean, famously, she tells him, "You lie beneath me."
Exactly. And that really sets the stage for everything that follows. It's like this early declaration of a woman's abandoning equality.
Right. I mean, even though it's a satirical text, it's still a pretty powerful statement, right? To have a woman just outright refusing to be in that subservient position.
I think so. Definitely.
Yeah.
And the consequences of her defiance are pretty immediate. She pronounces God's name, which is seen as this powerful act of rebellion, and flees the Garden of Eden.
Wow.
And in response, God sends 3 angels. Their names are Sinoi, Sansanoi, and Samangeloff. This is supposed to bring her back.
But she refuses. Yeah, she absolutely refuses to go back. And eventually she ends up making a deal with Semiel, this powerful demon. And I think this is where Ben Sira's text is so interesting. It's like he's trying to bring together all of these different traditions about Lilith that were probably circulating at the time.
Oh, you mean like giving an origin story to her demonic nature?
Exactly, yeah. And at the same time, he's also trying to explain, childbirth protection rituals that were probably in practice, long before his writing.
It's like he's taking these existing anxieties, like about, childbirth and infant mortality, and weaving them into this really engaging narrative.
Right, right. He's giving those fears a framework. He's giving them a story.
Exactly. And speaking of tangible evidence, right, like we actually have physical objects that show just how deeply rooted this fear of Lilith was. Specifically these amulets and incantation bowls, which were believed to have this protective power. Can you tell us a bit more about those?
Yeah, so these incantation bowls, they're really fascinating. They date back to around the 5th to 8th centuries CE. They're made of ceramic, and they would have these incantations written on them, often accompanied by an image of Lilith.
Okay.
And their purpose was to trap demons, especially the ones that were thought to, threaten mothers and newborns. They'd often bury these bowls under doorways.
Like a magical barrier against harm, almost.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. It really speaks to, the level of anxiety that people must have felt back then, right?
Yeah. And they're not just passively accepting their fate. They're trying to actively protect themselves.
Right. And it's interesting because the use of these bowls, it eventually gets replaced by metal or paper amulets. And those amulets would often depict Lilith along with these prayers for protection, sometimes even invoking the names of those 3 angels that were sent to bring her back to Eden, Sinoi, Sansanoi, and Samangeloff. Mm-hmm. So it's like the tools might have evolved, but the fear of Lilith, the need to protect oneself from her, that persisted.
And, what's interesting is that some communities still use these amulets today. Like they're still very much a part of certain traditions. It really shows how deep this fear of Lilith was, and in some cases still is.
Yeah. And as we start looking at later rabbinic commentaries and folktales, we see a shift in how Lilith is portrayed. She goes from being, rebellious to being actively vengeful, cursed for defying both God and Adam.
Oh, yeah.
It's fascinating how her image kind of darkens over time.
Yeah. So what are some of the ways that this darker portrayal of Lilith manifests in these later texts?
Well, for instance, the Babylonian Talmud actually warns against men sleeping alone. They say that they might become Lilith's target.
Oh, wow.
And this warning was linked to the belief that Lilith she'd steal semen in order to create demon offspring.
So it's like an ancient explanation for nocturnal emissions, but also speaks to these larger societal anxieties about female sexuality.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're exactly right. It's about female sexuality, but also about uncontrolled women. And Lilith really becomes this symbol, she represents this potent, independent female force that's seen as threatening to the established order.
Right.
And there are even some Hasidic folktales that depict legal battles between human children and demon children for inheritance rights.
Like Lilith's offspring are actually trying to claim their place in the human world.
Yeah. It's like Lilith's children born from this stolen seed. They could disrupt these lines of inheritance and upset the whole balance of the human world.
Wow. So she's not just a threat to individuals anymore, but a threat to society as a whole. That's a pretty big shift.
It is. And then you get to the 20th century and it's like, wow, Lilith's story takes this really interesting turn. She goes from being this demonized figure to being reclaimed as like this symbol in feminist movements.
Yeah. It's almost like a complete 180, right?
Yeah. It is. And there are a lot of factors that contributed to this shift, but one of the key moments was an article by Lily Rivlin in 1972.
Oh, yeah.
It was in Miss Magazine, and her article really kind of sparked this conversation about reinterpreting Lilith, about, not seeing her as a threat, but as a figure who defied patriarchal expectations.
So instead of being like the bad girl of Jewish folklore, she becomes like a potential role model for people who are, trying to challenge traditional gender roles.
Yeah, exactly. And Rivlin wasn't alone in this. In 1976, a Jewish feminist publication called Lilith was launched.
Wow. Naming a feminist publication after this figure who was once feared and ostracized. That's a pretty bold statement.
It is. It is. It really shows how much Lilith's image was changing. And in the first issue of Lilith magazine, there was this piece by Aviva Cantor-Zukoff, and she talked about Lilith's her strength and assertiveness and how she refuses to cooperate in her own victimization.
Wow. That's powerful.
It is. It's like they're saying, let's look beyond this demonized image and see the strength in her rebellion, her refusal to conform.
So Lilith's story then becomes a story about empowerment, about challenging the status quo.
Exactly. And this reinterpretation really resonated with people. Lilith became a symbol for women who were seeking autonomy, for people who were fighting for the right to make their own choices.
I mean, it's amazing, right? That this figure who was once used to control women through fear is now being used to empower them. That speaks to the adaptability of these myths,
Yeah. It shows how these stories can evolve alongside societal values.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that the stories we tell ourselves reflect our deepest fears and aspirations. And as those fears and aspirations change, so do the stories.
Right. And it's not just limited to academic or feminist circles either, right? Lilith starts popping up in pop culture too.
Yeah. I mean, you think about her appearances in TV shows like Sabrina or Frasier, and then there's Lilith Fair, the music festival.
Oh, right, yeah.
Which was this celebration of women in music. So, I mean, Lilith's image had really come full circle at that point.
Yeah. It's really interesting to think about this recurring theme of Lilith and the Ez sound, almost like this snake's hiss. You hear it in her name. You hear it in the names of the angels that are sent to retrieve her, even in the names invoked on the amulets. What do you make of that connection?
Well, in a lot of cultures, snakes are associated with wisdom, with danger, with transformation. So it makes sense that sound, would be linked to Lilith. It's almost like the subtle way of connecting her to these powerful concepts, these ideas about change, about challenging assumptions.
That adds another layer to her story, right?
Yeah.
She might be feared, but she's also, there's a certain level of respect there, even awe.
That duality is what makes her so compelling, She
Yeah.
defies easy categorization.
So to kind of recap, we've explored this journey, right? From ancient origins to feminist icon. We've seen how Lilith's story has been shaped by cultural anxieties, by changing social values, and by this human desire to make sense of the unknown. I mean, it's incredible to think that from just a brief mention in the book of Isaiah, Lilith's story it's become this whole thing, right?
Yeah.
Like ancient demonology, societal anxieties, feminist thought. It's really quite remarkable.
It shows you how these figures from mythology and folklore, they can have this real staying power. They tap into something very fundamental about the human experience.
So as we wrap up our deep dive here, what would you say is the main takeaway for our listener? Why does Lilith still resonate so strongly, even now?
I think it's because she represents something that we all grapple with,
Yeah.
This yearning for autonomy, this struggle against limitations, and the power of challenging the status quo, right?
She's a reminder that sometimes you got to forge your own path, even if it means going against the grain.
Yeah.
That's the only way to truly find yourself,
Yeah, and that's such a powerful message, especially for people who feel marginalized or overlooked. I mean, Lilith's journey from demon to feminist icon, it reminds us that the stories we choose to tell, the figures we embrace, it says a lot about who we are and what we value as a society.
And as we've seen, those stories aren't fixed. They evolve. They take on new meanings.
Yeah.
And that in turn challenges us to re-examine our own beliefs.
Right. Lilith's story is also, it's like an invitation to go deeper, to look beyond simple categories of good and evil and to recognize that complexity, that duality, it exists in all of us.
Absolutely. So as we finish up this deep dive, we really want to encourage you, the listener, to think about what Lilith's story means to you, what resonates with you. Is it her defiant spirit, her pursuit of independence, her willingness to challenge those in power? We hope this exploration has given you some new insights into this complex and compelling figure.